So the most recent episode of The Bad Batch gave us a pretty good look at a large mining facility that was operated by one of the major companies in the Separatist Alliance, at least during and likely before the war, and we saw what had come of it after the end of the conflict, and I figured today we could take a closer look at not necessarily the political hole left by the surrendering of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, but the economic impact of the collapse of such a large faction. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So as many of us know, the Separatist Alliance was an alliance of various different corporations, including massive banking institutions like the Banking Clan, major trade organizations like the Commerce Guild or the Trade Federation, and large manufacturing powerhouses like the Techno Union. All of these corporations pledged their allegiance, their assets, and their facilities to the Separatist war effort, and many of those made up the backbone of the Separatist military throughout the duration of the conflict. It wasn't really until after the war that a lot of these facilities ended up for grabs. You see, a lot of these corporations basically ceased to exist following the end of the conflict, with their very existence being tied inseparably to the existence of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. You see, a lot of these companies would have made these deals before the outbreak of the war, when victory seemed all but certain. But regardless of that, the end result is that at the end of this conflict, all of these companies were essentially defunct, with their assets being up for grabs. So what exactly happened to the massive economic vacuum left behind? Well, for starters, let's go over what some of these assets would have looked like. We know for major trade organizations, it's pretty straightforward. They would have had vast fleets of large trade ships, as well as these sort of back-end resources, things like warehouses, for example, for storing these resources. Now, in the case of the Trade Federation, we know a lot of these massive cargo ships were converted into warships. Look at the Lucrehulk-class battleship, for example. But it wasn't just trade organizations. You have institutions like the Banking Clan, for example, that had massive sums of money under their control, and a vast network of communication infrastructure to facilitate quicker banking transactions. And then you have manufacturing organizations like the Techno Union, which had basically entire supply chains, from massive deep hole mines designed to gather raw resources, to factories designed to churn out tanks and other war materials for the war effort. So what happens to all of this when the war ends? Well, some of this stuff was actually captured before the end of the war. Look at institutions like the Banking Clan's headquarters on Scipio, which was captured by the Republic in the later days of the conflict, and we can see in that case they ended up confiscating a fairly large sum of Republic credits from the Banking Clan. But in most of these cases, these facilities stayed in Separatist space until the end of the conflict, and when the conflict was over, that space was returned to the Galactic Empire, and the question became what happens to these companies as an intellectual institution, and what happens to the company's assets. And that's where things get a little complicated. Now, we know that in their pre-war forms, none of these companies survived the end of the conflict. Only a handful of them remaining even in name, and those that remained in name remained in a very different state. First off, a lot of companies didn't survive. Things like the Trade Federation, for example, were simply abolished, with most of their resources having been destroyed in the conflict anyway. The few remaining ships were sent to scrapyards or sold off to independent contractors or operators to use for their own purposes, mostly the ships that hadn't been converted to military vessels. Those that had been converted to military purposes were likely sent to scrapyards like the Republic vessels during the first few years after the end of the war. And that's likely the case for most things that had seen military application, things that had been converted to serve as warships. You have great examples of this in the Lucrehulk-class battleships that had been given weapons, and similarly the Munificent-class frigates, which were originally sort of communication frigates that had been beefed up with more advanced weapons for carrying out offensive operations during the conflict. But what about the other assets? Well, a lot of the companies that ceased to exist, their assets simply became public assets. They were either given over to the Galactic Empire in the case of larger mines and other sort of more expansive and useful assets, but the ones that were useless to the Galactic Empire were simply abandoned, left to the workers who were operating them or the locals in the area with no control and likely some confusion over who controlled these sites. This is probably how we get that mine that we see in The Bad Batch. It was simply not important enough for the Empire to sweep in and actually utilize it, so it ended up basically kind of this no man's land, where no one's really quite sure who owns the mine on paper, but they know that local work factions have taken over it on a de facto sense. That being said, they didn't all cease to exist. A few companies likely did continue on past the end of the war. These are companies that had more of a financial impact on the conflict as opposed to those that had a direct military impact, and ones with resources that would be valuable to the Empire. But these companies continued on in a very different way. A lot of them were fairly nationalized by the end of the conflict, with them being more reliant on whichever government they were serving. And with the collapse of the Separatists, many of them ended up falling under the umbrella of the control of the Galactic Empire. This would have meant most of their profits would have ended up going to the government itself, and many of the large-scale decisions would have been made by Imperial officials. All in all, this is a very interesting and often unexplored aspect of the end of the Clone Wars, seeing as the war was really this competition between a group of corporations trying to avoid taxes and a federal government. But this is just one of the many interesting complexities surrounding the end of the Clone Wars. It's not simply the off button for the droids, but you have so much more beyond that, from these economic ramifications to the Separatist holdouts who held on to the ideals of the Separatists long after the end of the conflict. And if you'd like to learn about the Empire's war against all of these Separatist holdouts scattered all across the galaxy, I'll leave a link up here to my video on that. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments, how much of these resources do you think are actually still under the control of Separatist holdouts? Do you think they still have a vast array of former Separatist infrastructure under their command, or do you think most of the larger corporate assets are likely gone or in limbo at this point? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars, you can leave that down below in the comments as well. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.